Many of us were absolutely sickened by the jury's decision in the George Zimmerman case when he was found not guilty of killing Trayvon Martin. Folks said, how in the world could that happen? How could the injustice take place? And what can be done to change the laws in Florida, but also in many other states, to make sure it doesn't happen again? Author Lisa Bloom, she's a lawyer and a journalist. She has a new book out. It is called Suspicion Nation: The Inside Story of the Trayvon Martin Injustice and Why We Continue to Repeat It. She joins me right now via Skype from Los Angeles. Lisa, first of all, always good to see you. Welcome to News One Now.
Hi, Roland. Thanks for having me on.
Why do you say that this was an absolute injustice, this decision, the George Zimmerman decision in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin?
I followed this case gavel to gavel for NBC News and MSNBC, and as I did, I saw a case that was going off the rails. Very strange decisions being made by the prosecutors, not arguing a theory of the case, witnesses who seemed to be unprepared, excellent evidence that they had at their disposal that they weren't using. And when the case was over, Roland, I just couldn't put it behind me. I had to do my own investigation. I had to interview the witnesses and the lawyers and the jurors and find out what really happened. Because as you say, this was an iconic case. This was an important case. And what I found really shocked me, disturbed me even more. And the results are in my book, Suspicion Nation, because I felt that America should know. We should know what happened. Many of us had this feeling in our gut that something went wrong. Well, I'm here to say, as a lawyer and as a journalist, something did go wrong. Something went very wrong behind the scenes. The prosecutors just failed to make a very winnable case.
You said, quote, the state's biggest blunder in summation is failure to offer its own theory of the case. For the most part, as they had throughout the trial, prosecutors went along with the defense's version of what happened that night, arguing only the details around the edges. That's at the heart of what a prosecution is supposed to do, argue their own theory.
That's right. And I have never seen a prosecutor win a case without arguing a theory of the case. These prosecutors surely knew that they had to do that. That's a rookie mistake, Roland. In many senses, Trayvon Martin was the one put on trial by the defense, and he didn't have an advocate in the courtroom. Trayvon Martin did not get a fair trial. The prosecutors simply did not advocate for him the way that they should have.
You also say that today almost no one will admit to racial animus of any kind. And what happens is, when it comes to these sort of trials, folks say, oh, no, let's not bring up race. We don't want to bring up the race card, things along those lines. But for many of us who watched it, there was no denying, like I kept saying on CNN, I kept saying on TV One and elsewhere, this whole thing started by George Zimmerman making a racial assumption of seeing a black kid in a hoodie saying he doesn't belong here.
There's no question about it, Roland. That's why millions of us demonstrated in the street to get George Zimmerman arrested, because the racial implications were obvious. Yet the prosecution was silent on the issue in the courtroom, even when highly offensive racial stereotypes were being offered by the defense. I'll give you one quick example from the book. The defense was arguing that there were two burglars in the neighborhood 6 months earlier who were African American. The prosecution should have been on their feet objecting. What did that have to do with Trayvon Martin? He had no connection to those burglars whatsoever. To attribute the wrongs of two African Americans to all African Americans is the very definition of racism. But the prosecution never said so. And so the case went to the jury with all of these wrong-headed assumptions about race.
You also deal with what is a fundamental issue, and that is this whole school-to-prison pipeline in Florida. Of course, the defense tried to bring in Trayvon being suspended and being in trouble in school. I mean, one of the troubling aspects of what's happening in Florida is that the school systems are essentially criminalizing everything. And so you have these kids who are in the 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. They've already got a number of things stacked up dealing with the court system that affects them later on.
That's right. And in the book, I call this the push out and lockout crisis. So many African American kids who are going to school in subpar schools are locked out of better educational opportunities. And they're pushed out because there's no question that suspensions and expulsions are far higher among African Americans, especially black boys. And that was the case for Trayvon Martin. Many people on the right say, oh, he was a delinquent, he was a bad kid because he'd been suspended 3 times. And I think many people, when they hear that, they think, wow, 3 suspensions, a does sound like he was a problem. But when you drill down on what he was suspended for, as I do in the book, it turns out they were extremely minor common offenses. Tardiness, for example. Can you imagine when we were in school, Roland, if we had been suspended from school every time we were tardy, writing on a locker, and the final one, the more serious one, was having a baggie with marijuana residue. Now, there's no question that these are behavioral problems that the school should be addressing, but he was suspended for 1 day, 3 days, and 10 days. And this was in violation of the school's own rules. So I drilled down in the book on what you're supposed to get under that Miami High School school rules for various offenses. The first one should not have resulted in a suspension at all. The second one probably should not have resulted in a suspension. And the third should have resulted in only a very brief suspension. Unfortunately, the final suspension, that 10-day suspension, is the very reason why Trayvon Martin was not at home in Miami. He was many hours away in Sanford, Florida, on that terrible night when he was shot and killed.
Folks, the book is called Suspicion Nation, the inside story of the Trayvon Martin injustice and why we continue to repeat it. It is a phenomenal book by a strong voice out there for Justice Lisa Bloom. We certainly appreciate you talking about the book. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Roland.